In this video, we are going to go over using a back split stitch in text. So we're going to be stitching a bide right here, and I'm going to be using 4 strands just because that's a little bit easier on text to go lower than 6 strands. 6 strands gets a little thick, so for that reason, I'm going to go down to 4 strands. Now, when using a back split stitch for text, your stitches are not going to be the same length every single time. You want to try and keep them as cohesive as possible, but you need to also understand it's not going to be like it is here when we did our back split stitch where every stitch is exactly the same length. So let's get started here on the A. So I'm going to come up, and then I'm going to follow my tracing, and I'm only going to go maybe about half the size I would have gone over here. Now I'm going half a stitch length forward, and I'm going to go back and split. Now we're just going to continue doing that until we have filled in the A. The A is a pretty simple letter for this example. Whenever we get over to this cursive going around in loops, it will get a little bit harder, and I can give you some more tips. But for right now, what you're doing is you're just doing the same thing as the back split stitch that you've done over here, but you are having to do your stitches maybe a little bit smaller and a little bit closer together. Now, when you stitch text, I do like to go in the order as if you were writing it. So with the A, we wouldn't start here and go this way. We're going to start at the top of the A and go around and then follow our line as if we are writing the actual word. Now, one thing I really enjoy about using a back split stitch for text is that you can use your needle to manipulate just a little bit where you want the floss to go. If you feel like that line right here is a little too straight, you can use your needle to kind of pull it a little bit more to the left, pull it a little more to the right, and get it exactly the way you want it to look. So for example, that stitch right there looks a little too straight for me. So when I come up here, I'm going to use my needle to kind of pull that stitch down and kind of pin it in place more of where I want it to be. All right, so as I'm finishing this letter A, the A stops and it goes into that little curve at the bottom of the letter. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up, I'm not going to grab my woven wheel. I'm going to pick up my needle and come down here, and I am going to split my text, but I'm only going to, or split my stitch, but I'm only going to split it right at that tip. I'm not going halfway into that previous stitch. So I'm just splitting it right here at the tip. So that way they're connecting, but they're not necessarily, I'm not necessarily splitting it directly in the middle. I'm recording videos, buddy. Please go back in your room.
Like, are you going to this for going to?
Not for a while. All right, so now as we get to these kind of longer portions, your stitches can get a little bit longer, but just keep in mind if you make your stitches too long here, they are going to look different than where they were in the A. They're going to look closer together in the A, and then as you go on this curve, they're going to look too far apart. So while you can create some distance, don't create too much distance. So now that we're getting around this curve, I need to make sure my stitches get a little bit closer together. Now right here at this top curve, I'm not going to be able to split all the way down here because that's going to make the stitch look funny. So similar to what we did over here with the A, I'm going to only split a little bit into the tip of that last stitch I made. And if when you pull the stitch down you realize it looks a little funky, go ahead and take it out and fix it. You could try and do one more stitch and see if maybe another stitch would fix it, but it's almost always better to fix it while you're still in the spot rather than having to pull out multiple stitches and then fix it. Now, as I get ready to cross over this first line down here, I am going to go over it. I'm not going to attempt to just stitch up to the line. I'm going to fully go over it, just as if you were doing, if you're writing with a pencil or a marker, you wouldn't pick up your pen and just stop and then pick it up again after the line. You're going to actually just go directly over it. So you can see there, my needle's now right above that line, and I'm going to bring this stitch over that previous line. Now, as we get into this tight circle right here for this B, what I always tell my stitchers to do is act like your needle is a race car and you are on a racetrack. Often when you see racers on racetracks, I've never watched racing, but this is the analogy I always think of. There are drivers who are on the outside of the track, the wider portion of the track. So as you're stitching this little loop right here, think about stitching on the outside of the tracing, so that you're giving yourself as much wiggle room there in the middle as possible. So my needle is almost coming right outside of the tracing that I have there rather than on it directly, just so that I can leave myself enough room. And it does get a little, or takes a little bit of time to get used to going around such tight corners with a back stitch, or with any stitch really. And so the more you practice it, the more you realize how few stitches you might need or how many stitches if you need more. And you can also use your needle, once you've finished, you can use your needle to kind of open the space up a little bit, because sometimes as you stitch it, the floss gets a little bit thicker and it encloses on itself. And I'll show you what I mean in just a second. This might not enclose too much on itself, but often you have to do this kind of racetrack style stitching on these letters that enclose on themselves, and like an E, for example. E's and B's are some of the biggest culprits in this situation. Okay, so I'm coming over here. I'm going to stitch over that last line. And I'm going to make one more stitch before I show you what I'm talking about as far as using your needle to kind of open it up a bit. So I can use the back of my needle, the dull part, to kind of put it in that little hole and just stretch it out a bit and make it a little more visible. But it honestly doesn't need to be super visible, because you're still getting the look of what the B is supposed to be. As long as it doesn't fully enclose on itself, then you are doing great. Now, as we get to this eye, we are just going to, you have two options, honestly. I normally use just a very tiny back stitch. You could also use a French knot. Sometimes French knots, I think, are a little too thick for my liking for an eye. And so I'll stick with that back stitch. So I'm going to come up here, just make the smallest of small stitches. Oops. When knots like this happen, just use your needle to kind of pull on them. Okay, now I'm coming down here and I'm going to split right at the tip of this last back split stitch I made. And keep going. And that's how you complete a back split stitch on text. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe for more embroidery tutorials.